Naisohn.
Hi, Sonjel. How are you?
I'm good. I'm good. Thank you so much for taking this time to chat with me. I've been looking forward to our conversation, and I want to hear all about the new volume of the Baha'i World that's coming out.
It's a pleasure, and thank you to the Baha'i blog for making this space available. I think this is a wonderful development, and it's something very exciting to talk about. So I've also been looking forward to the opportunity. So
Fantastic. I have quite a few questions, but I was thinking maybe the best place to start would be to talk about the significance of the Baha'i World volumes, both historically and today.
that's a good question. Um, well, for people who don't know anything or much about the Baha'i World volumes, I can just give a brief primer. Um, the the Baha'i World is a series of publications that um, that was printed in book form from 1926 through 2006. The origin of the idea was actually very interesting. There was an American Baha'i named Horace Hawley who was himself a writer and a poet. And when he discovered the faith, really fell in love with the vision of the faith and was eager to see these teachings become available to a wider audience and to really connect with the world of thought. And he was very much engaged in literary circles and artistic circles, both when he lived in Paris for a period of time and also back in the United States with many of the modernist painters and writers of his time. And so was very much engaged in the discourses around the arts and around the evolution of thought in modernism and the modernism movement. And so he proposed to Shoghi Effendi in 1924 through communication that they had with one another. He proposed the idea of a publication that could bring together the activities of the Baha'i community worldwide into one sort of yearbook that could be published every year and sort of make available to people both the vision and teachings of the Baha'i faith, but also how it's finding expression in the world as it grows.
Right.
And Shoghi Effendi really responded wholeheartedly with full support for this idea, and you can see that in his correspondence, and very sort of quickly mobilized the resources of the faith to support this initiative and make it successful. And they put together an editorial team and very quickly turned around the idea into a first book, which was called Baha'i Yearbook, and which was published in 1926, and it covered the year 1925 to 1926. Actually, you can see the books here, and the very first one, unfortunately, I don't have an original. These were reprinted.
Right.
And so some of the ones I have here, the colored ones are originals, but then the reprints were all in this dark blue. And so it's very hard to find the original yearbook anywhere. I haven't been able to find an original copy of it. So this is a reprint of it. But you can access it also. There's all of these are on PDF form on the Baha'i.org website as well.
Right.
So it's very short. It's, some of them got really, really thick, like over 1,000 pages. But this one was very short and in many ways extremely beautiful. I mean, it reflects, the optimism and hope of a community that was very small, but already quite diverse and quite revolutionary, both in its thinking and also what it was doing in society. I mean, in the United States, where Horace Hawley lived, there was segregation, but Baha'is had integrated meetings, and Abdu'l Baha really pushed them to try to, push the envelope in terms of racial relations and to establish racial unity in the United States, and to not allow the Baha'i community to be complacent in that respect. But going back to the Baha'i World, the first volume came out in 1926, and it's interesting because already you could see that they were grappling with certain questions, and Shoghi Effendi was clearly engaged in this process very closely. So in the second volume, they write an apology actually in their introduction to the book, saying, really the book it's meant to be a global book, but a lot of it was North America and Europe. And so they were striving at that point. They were very conscious that they wanted the voice of the world community to be captured, and the experience of the world community to be captured through the volumes of the Baha'i World, and that these volumes were written not for the Baha'i community. They were really written as an attempt to make this new movement, this new faith, more and more present in public thought, and to share these teachings and their expression in what the Shoghi Effendi described as the critical and intelligent inquirer of whatever class, creed, or race.
Right.
It was really meant to appeal to the world of the intellect, and to connect the revelation of Baha'u'llah with people who are asking the big questions about what's happening in the world. So, and it was given a lot of resources. So over the next 80 years, these volumes were, continued to be published in very high quality.
Right.
They were a lot of work. And as I mentioned, they became thicker and thicker over time. Just to give you an example, to compare volume 13 with volume 1, which was, to a certain extent also, this volume 13, which is a long volume, 1954 to 1963, fell at a time when there was a lot of movement in terms of the growth of the Baha'i faith, and it spread around the world. So there was a lot to capture. So the idea of it being a yearbook wasn't sustainable, and that became very clear right away. So they decided to make it every 2 years, and then for a time it became every 4 years. But despite the fortunes of the faith, because the Baha'i faith went through many different periods of struggle in the 20th century, persecution in Iran, eventually revolution, which really tried to get rid of the Baha'i, extinguish the Baha'i community in that country, which was a big source of the intellectual life of the Baha'i community, but also the resources. And of course, the various economic crises that humanity went through. Despite all of those periods, these books were published. So they're an interesting record, not only of the development of the Baha'i community, but also the development of the Baha'i community in a very tumultuous century, with amazing advancements and also, terrible conflicts and disasters that, interestingly enough, in the century before, Baha'u'llah had written about, addressed so many of these ideas that humanity was then grappling with in the 20th century. So these Baha'i World volumes, for 80 years, they became a record of the unfoldment of the faith in the 20th century during what we call the formative age, which was the period after the passing of Abdul Baha.
Right.
And with the beginning of the institution of the guardianship, and eventually the universal house of justice. And so for 80 years, we had these wonderful books that were capturing the spread of the faith, and stats and figures and major developments, and also trying to present the faith to this intelligent audience, to scholars, to the general public, to students of the faith. And so that our own evolution in our thinking about what the faith is, what it's achieving, how it's going to translate these noble teachings into practical form in the world, all of that you see, expressed in book after book, decade after decade. So it's a wonderful record of the emergence of a new faith in the world and its effort to bring about change in the world and to grow and to spread and bring these teachings to all of humanity. And so when you flip through the volumes, it's beautiful because they're filled with photographs from around the world, always, like communities in remote villages, communities in big urban centers, very sophisticated communities, meetings with leaders of thought and, public officials. And then, you might see villagers in remote villages where there's no communication, no access to anything. I mean, and you saw that the faith had over this century, become part of the life of almost every population of humanity.
Right.
And that was recorded through these volumes. So it's a record. By the time we got to 1992, the faith had already, that was 100 years after the passing of Baha'u'llah. We had more resources. We had grown a lot as a Baha'i community. We were more than 5 million, as opposed to the beginning of these volumes where we were probably somewhere around 50 to 100,000 people in the world, Baha'is. By the time we got to the 90s, there were more than 5 million Baha'is in the world. So, and we had a very developed Baha'i World Center at that point, and we had offices in the United Nations and, offices, of external affairs for national spiritual assemblies around the world. So we were at a different level of capacity and presence in the world. And so the question of what would happen with the Baha'i World was raised in the mid 80s. And at that time, the Baha'is of Iran were suffering tremendously under a new regime, which was, not only demonizing the community, but also trying to exterminate the community.
Right.
And so at the same time, the Baha'i community had a very prominent role in the UN, trying to promote processes towards peace, and was really a major actor in that respect as a non-governmental organization. And the Universal House of Justice had published a peace message, which was just an extraordinary message. So it was in that time that they were thinking about, well, what happens with this? What do we do with the Baha'i World now? I mean, at the time when it was first published, it was one of the few authoritative things that could be available to people. It was put into libraries. It was quite comprehensive. It captured Baha'i thought, introduction to the Baha'i faith. It also had like the activities of the worldwide Baha'i community, and then there were articles on the topics of the day, the big issues of our time: peace, racism, poverty. You name it. There were different articles written, trying to tackle those issues. And so now did we need such a comprehensive work? And I think the feeling at that time was that, well, let these volumes be more oriented towards promoting the principles of the faith to the wider public, especially in our external affairs type of public information work that we were doing. So for a period of time, we had yearbooks from 1992 to 2006, which were more in the spirit of public information,
Right.
and written kind of like for diplomats and journalists, and kind of and shorter and annual. And they had a little bit, like they have a similar structure. Each time they would highlight like a social action organization in the world. They would cover a couple of big topics. There would be a World Watch article that would look at, a number of topics, facing humanity. It was a wonderful book that came out till 2006. At that point, then the question was, well, everything's going online. We have so many websites now, and we're developing our web presence as a Baha'i community. What do we do with, is there a need for the Baha'i World anymore? And if there is a need for it, what should it look like now? So it was put in abeyance for a while, actually. That question was held, and wasn't really answered for some time, from 2006 to 2019. And then in 2019, the Universal House of Justice launched a website called the Baha'i World. And that website was primarily created to do what the last part of most of these volumes did, which was essays and articles on societal issues. So the website is a place to capture advances in Baha'i thinking and also in our practice, like in what we're doing in the world. Like, let's say if we have some advancements in our social and economic development initiatives that are showing promise that we think really connect with questions that humanity is grappling with, or then we will try to publish articles on those developments as a contribution to the advancement of thought in the world at large. And so that's what the website was designed to do, and it also has evolved, but it has dozens of articles that are either new since 2019, or and then more even that we've taken from the old volumes. So we have in the library, you have like a set of articles that go all the way back to the 1920s. This is really nice. So we have articles on race that look at racism and the question of how to tackle racism in 1928, 1926, and you see, wow, I mean, this has been an ongoing theme that the Baha'i community has had at the very forefront of its thoughts since the earliest days of the community in this country, in the United States. And so then you can see, well, how has our experience evolved during this century? It's very nice to see the consistency of Baha'i effort, but also through these articles, you get a glimpse of how our approaches, our thinking have become more sophisticated with time and with experience.
Right.
So
what can we look forward to in this latest volume? Because I think you talked about kind of this shift for a period of time where it was more public relations focused, and then the website, which has the articles as its heart. So what's going to happen now?
So there's a new volume, which we anticipate will come out in the next 2 months. It will be in hand. People can purchase it. And it is I would say maybe a bit of a hybrid between what we had in the early volumes that were under the Guardian, and then eventually the House of, under the supervision of the Guardian, and then the House of Justice, those multi-year volumes that we talked about at the beginning. Somewhere between that, but that becomes almost impossible to do now, because now you have, an enormous community with way too much activity to cover in detail, across the world. And then something new that maybe is more informed by what we're doing in our efforts to participate in the discourses of society.
Right.
So the new volumes, I think we're striving through these volumes to take what's being learned through application of the Baha'i teaching. So, through our practices as a community in various settings around the world, and through how our thinking is evolving, and make that accessible to a general public in a beautiful form. So this is it's an effort to kind of mine Baha'i experience for insights, and then to try to translate those insights in a way that's relevant to society. And of course, we know that, well, many people still don't know what the Baha'i faith is, and many people have no interest in religion at all. So we're not expecting everyone to rush to the, to the bookstore to pick up, a copy of a religious community's sort of contribution to thought. But over time, I think the idea is that the Baha'i World volumes in this new series will help reshape our understanding of what religion is and what its contribution can be in society, and how religion can really transform communities towards progress, towards a kind of progress that I think many, many, many people long for. They don't know how to get there.
Right.
And we've been disappointed, perhaps, in some of the negative impacts of religious practice in the last centuries, and the way it's led to conflict. Maybe people have felt that it's held us back from progress or sometimes blocks.
Right.
Obviously, as Baha'is, we don't feel that's the whole picture. I mean, definitely that's the case, that there are, human communities. We do we have cultures and traditions and practices that sometimes can become obstacles to progress. But on the other hand, we need this spiritual impulse, and we need something that inspires and motivates us to sacrifice for the greater good,
Right.
to dedicate ourselves to long-term goals, not just for our own lifetime, but for our descendants, and that connects us with each other and with those who came before us and after us. And so religion is an undeniable force in propelling that kind of consciousness in human society. Now, it's often done in smaller groups, but the thing that Baha'is believe is so powerful about the experience of the Baha'i community today is that it really is a community that's trying to get rid of that boundary of inside and outside, and becoming less and less concerned about whether you're in, but how we can all work together and how we can bring knowledge from different sources, including religion, but religion in its most pure and its most essential form, to bear on the issues of our time, and the issues that are really the source of tremendous fear and despair in the world. And we don't know how we're going to get out of these things around conflict, hatred, division, polarization, and also our broken relationship with nature. So the Baha'i community, although it's relatively small still, has this wonderful experience of being able to help people bridge divides, traditionally oppositional groups who become part of one family. Their children marry each other. You can see in India caste systems now interacting with each other. In the United States, you see different racial groups from the last century till today who are working together in harmony and unity. It's not always easy, but they're striving because they believe that that there's some higher purpose in our existence and that we're called to do that. And so in that experience of the Baha'i community, we see hope for all of humanity. We think it demonstrates one example of how humanity can actually tackle its issues if it can orient itself around the right spiritual principles. So the Baha'i World is an attempt to describe how humanity is applying spiritual principles to begin to tackle the big questions of the day. And 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 to be able to describe that in a way that resonates with the reader who's not a Baha'i, who's not maybe so familiar with the ins and outs of what the Baha'i community is doing, but can find in the experience of the community hope, optimism,
Mm.
maybe insights that they can draw upon
Right.
in their organizations, or yeah. So that's the idea.
So the big questions of the day, like I have a funny, I have a, I guess I could guess which topics are covered in this upcoming volume, which questions of the day are being answered. But can you tell us a little bit specifically about what
Sure.
it
Yeah. Well, the volume draws on some of the content from the website with respect to contributions to discourse, because the volume covers also the development of the Baha'i community. So I can just say,
Right.
so there's several categories of content. So one of those categories, like was historically done in the multi-year volumes in the 1900s, is that it describes how the Baha'i faith grew in the last 15 years, how it developed. Grew, I don't mean grew just numerically, but
Right.
also how it matured and developed, and what sorts of processes were set in motion during this time, and what sort of fruits those processes have given rise to already. So there's that piece which looks actually at the experience of the Baha'i community itself. Then you have articles that look at the world of thought and like our ideas relating to the major issues of our time. And so the volume is not going to be comprehensive in that sense, but it touches on some of the big issues. For example, identity, which is a huge issue today. Like, what is our primary identity? How do we, in this sort of world of multiplying lesser and I shouldn't say lesser, these multiplying identity groups, which are in opposition together, how do we find identities that can unify us, but also acknowledge and honor the diversity that we have? And there's a very rich article on identity in the biome. There's an article on migration, which in the last decade has really come to the forefront of thought, and
Right.
again looks at how the Baha'i teachings and also Baha'i contributions at the UN are relating to the question of migration, and how do we think about migration historically and its impact today.
Right.
There is an article on social justice. There's an article looking at the role of public institutions, in public welfare. These are actually very rich, stimulating articles, and then there are a few historical articles that try to relate experiences in the past with challenges that we're facing today.
Right.
For example, there's an article on Abdul Baha's visit to the West,
Right.
and his interactions with leading thinkers in the peace movements of the time, and how in some ways the Baha'i conception of peace, world peace, and the oneness of humankind was radically different than where humanity was at the time, even the leading peace thinkers.
Mm-hmm.
And how Abdul Baha had to somehow put forward a vision that was way beyond what people were ready for,
Right.
and still connect with them where they're at.
Right.
And then how he himself also set in motion in the Baha'i community certain processes to try to promote peace. So there's a range of content in the article. And then there are publications, like more samples of publications that have been released at the international and national level as examples of how Baha'is are trying to contribute to the welfare and advancement of thinking in their societies. So we have publications from the Baha'i international community, which has offices
Right.
at the United Nations and at several regional hubs in the world. So in this case, we have one article from the Brussels office of the, which relates to the European institutions, European Union, European Parliament,
Right.
and then we have some from the offices of the United Nations in New York, and then we have a couple of statements that Baha'i communities made to their fellow citizens at very historic moments. So in the aggregate, you see how Baha'is are trying to contribute to questions that humanity is grappling with, and trying to draw on insights from the revelation and also our experience in the world, trying to apply the Baha'i teachings, and then translate those into an accessible language that others can relate to and maybe can be useful to others in the world as well. I guess one thing that excites me personally about an initiative like the Baha'i World is that it allows us to step back a little bit from our local reality a bit and to look at what we're trying to do locally, sometimes very successfully, sometimes very unsuccessfully, in terms of social and spiritual transformation, and to see its implications at this very higher level, at the civilizational level.
Right.
For example, being able to bring diverse people, not just diverse in terms of class or ethnicity or race, but really diverse in terms of thought, political inclinations, social, interests and social sort of ideologies, and to be able to create spaces that are not only the kinds of spaces that promote dialogue between these kinds of diverse actors in the world, but actually brings them closer together and helps them transcend their differences and find. I think that's one of the most interesting things, and not only at the level of talking, but also in terms of collaboration and social action, and in the work of organizations. And I think this is something in the face of the challenges that we encounter today that has it's actually rare and has so much power to it. And then many other things, educating young children, spiritually, so that we actually imagine the power of raising generations of children without prejudice in their hearts, raising generations of children whose spiritual beliefs are rational too. I mean, that they're able to think rationally about the world around them, that they can believe in something and yet tolerate and even invite diversity of thought. Like imagining cultivating these qualities in a generation of children. It's really a source of hope. And when we think about the implications of that, even though the day to day is very hard doing those things, it's really powerful when you think about, oh, okay, I'm not the only one. There's actually hundreds of thousands, millions of people in some instances that are participating in these processes around the world. And they're connected by a network. This organic network is very powerful. But it's very hard to see that when you're at the ground level.
Right.
And it's also not necessarily so visible in the world where people who are interested at that more meta level can see it yet.
Can see it. Right.
So something like the Baha'i World can help both the person on the ground level, who is in the day-to-day and only sees incremental changes, and sometimes those incremental changes are backwards, but like my wife, for example, has a junior youth group. There are 2 junior youth groups here in the Miami area, and she's working on those. Sometimes only 2 of them show up. Sometimes they have a whole mob of them show up and more, and it's like, but week in and week out, the quality of those relationships, the nature of their conversations, the nature of their interactions is evolving, is changing for the better. But then week to week, it might vary. And, for someone like that who's working with these, you may get lost in the weeds.
Right.
So being able to pull up and say, actually, this is not only happening everywhere, but actually its implications are enormous. And there's so much potential in this. And it's not the story of the Baha'is only. This is actually the story of humanity trying to reach a new stage of functioning, a new level of consciousness, a new level of innovation. Like we have all these technological and scientific innovations, but we also have spiritual innovations. That's what we're trying to discover, new kinds of spiritual instruments and tools for a more mature human race. And because it's very hard in a very unspiritual world to get anything off the ground in many places, it's very hard to see how powerful actually the potential is in these seeds that we're planting. And similarly, I think for that meta level, the people who are, sincerely not just looking to get their next position in government or whatever, but are actually really concerned with the state of the world and are looking around to see where there might be prospects for hope, where there might be new models, new innovations, this again is an opportunity for us. I think there's an opportunity for us to say, actually, human beings are capable of doing better than what we see.
Right.
Human beings can actually do the opposite of what is being highlighted day to day. They can actually cooperate. They can actually overcome hatred. They can actually forgive one another. And these are examples, and they're not fluff. These are actually real examples. They're messy. They're not perfect, but these are examples. So, increasingly as these examples grow and we learn how to communicate what we're learning from those examples, I think people's, and we're not the only ones making spiritual innovations or social innovations, but we're definitely doing it. And so, and as we become more desperate as a human family to find ways out of the mess that we're in, I think it would be very important for us to be able to show that humanity is capable of something different. So that's part of what excites me about the Baha'i World. I'm not saying that this is the way that it's going to happen, that just our own
Right.
publication is the way. It's going to be through the efforts of organizations and individuals at every level of society. But this is kind of an opportunity for us to model a little bit that aspiration that we have, to take what we're learning, draw out the power of that, the potentialities in that, and then to figure out how to share that in a way that the interested person in the world, that critical thinker in the world that's really looking for a way forward for humanity, can
Right.
see that potential that we see in what we're doing. I mean, that's the one piece I thought maybe if it didn't come through, uh, I would say I would. It's personally the most exciting thing about what we're doing with the Baha'i World. We, by the way, every time I say we, it's the Baha'i community. It's not we. It's not like some small little. It's many people connected to this process. But yeah, that's. I think that's the most exciting thing personally that I see in these efforts now.
I appreciate you spending your time not only just on working on the volume, because I know that you have been one of the many people involved, but thank you for spending the time to talk to me about it too.
It was a pleasure. Thanks, Sonjel.